Hello and welcome to Global Eye. On the show today, we focus on the big diplomacy push between the United States and China. We also throw the spotlight on the upcoming meeting between US Trade Representative Catherine Tai and India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. And with the COP26 Climate Summit winding up in Glasgow, we also speak with furniture maker IKEA's parent company Inca Group about the role of the private sector in climate action. But first, the big developments in global diplomacy, where US President Joe Biden will hold a virtual meeting with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. The meeting comes amidst trade tensions between the two countries, as well as the US criticism of China's military activities. China has also extended an olive branch, with President Xi saying that China is ready to manage differences with the United States and enhance cooperation across the board. We're now joined by Anant Krishnan, correspondent for The Hindu. He is joining us from Hong Kong. Anant, thank you very much for joining us. Now, just ahead of that virtual summit between President Xi and President Biden, the CCP has passed a landmark resolution which really paves the way for Xi Jinping's third term. What is the significance of this resolution first?
Well, Parikshit, it's only the third such resolution that the Communist Party has passed in its 100-year history. The last such resolution was in 1981. It's about history ostensibly, but its real significance, Parikshit, is about the future in terms of what it means for Xi Jinping standing in the party. To put it very simply, Parikshit, it essentially elevates Xi's standing almost on a par with Mao Zedong. It makes Xi Jinping synonymous with the Communist Party. It pretty much ensures he's politically dominant. It also announces that the next party congress that's going to take place in October, most likely next year, where Xi Jinping will begin his next 5-year term. He will be in a position to appoint officials who will answer to him. So he is going into this summit with Biden in a position of strength, certainly when you look at domestic politics in China after the holding of this plenum this week. There's no doubt about that. He's going to be here for the next 5 years. So in a sense, Parikshit, he does not have the pressure to deliver immediately on the US-China front in a way that Biden might have, which is something to keep in mind, that they both are kind of operating on different term limits and timelines ahead of the summit at a time when the relationship is facing so many problems.
So in this context, Anant, what is China looking to achieve from this virtual summit with President Biden?
In a way, Parikshit, I think just the fact that this summit is happening is a win for China, and it is a little bit puzzling, I'd say, from an Indian observer's point of view, why the US was so keen to have this summit when, to be quite frank, Parikshit, there's very little scope of any major headway that's going to be made in some of the issues that the US is concerned by, whether it's China's economic practices, whether it's human rights, whether it's Xinjiang, whether it's Taiwan. I think there's very little prospect, really, of the Chinese making big changes in the way that the US would want. Just to look at how the summit even happened, Parikshit, it's quite interesting. The relationship began, the Biden administration and the Xi Jinping government's first interactions in March this year were very acrimonious. Then what you did have was the Chinese presenting the US with two lists of demands of what they wanted in July. And we have seen a little bit of caving from the US in agreeing to some of those demands, including withdrawing all charges against Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou, was allowed to leave Canada and go back to China to a big hero's welcome. And that was one of the preconditions, reading between the lines, of having this summit, and China got that done. But I am really expecting very little from the summit beyond low-hanging fruit, such as maybe reopening consulates that were shut during the Trump administration's time, maybe easing up on visa restrictions that would allow Chinese students to go back to the US in bigger numbers, something that the Trump administration has curtailed. But the big structural problems, Parikshit, in the relationship aren't going anywhere.
Right. Do you think this may reduce the tensions, allay some of those tensions between US and China, or not at all? And do you think Xi Jinping is likely to raise US stand on Taiwan, for that matter, maritime security, South China Sea, border tensions with India?
I think you are seeing an effort by both sides to tone down tensions. You saw that last month when you had the US NSA Jake Sullivan have this marathon meeting with China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi, which is when they agreed to actually have this virtual summit. So for sure, you're going to see a temporary dialing down of tensions. But just as I said, the structural problems in this relationship are deep rooted. I think there's a bipartisan a consensus in the US right now on this confrontational nature of relations with China. There's very little appetite for anyone in Washington. It's pretty clear to make huge concessions that the Chinese would want to see. Even if you look at the recent climate deal, Parikshit, if you look beyond the fanfare of what was announced by the US and the Chinese, a surprise announcement at COP26, there's very little beyond what they agreed 7 years ago during the Barack Obama administration's time in a deal with Xi Jinping. It seems like as if they're going back to the future. So a lot of it is atmospherics. Sure, it may dial down tensions for now, but if you look at the big issues, whether it's Xinjiang or Taiwan or even on the trade front, it's difficult to see any major changes coming out of this.
All right, so unlikely to see any major tensions, but hopefully this will further reduce some amount of tension between the both sides. Thank you very much, Anant. We've run out of time, but thank you for giving us a perspective on that much awaited. The whole world would be watching that meeting very, very closely between the two leaders. Thanks once again for joining us here on Global Eye. Now, like we told you before, USTR, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, and India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal will hold an in-person meeting in the third week of this month when the USTR visits India on a two-day trip. The two held a virtual meeting on the 2nd of November where they agreed to take a comprehensive look at ways to expand bilateral trade ties. The two countries also shared perspectives on how to reach meaningful outcomes at the upcoming World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference that will be held in Geneva from the 30th of November to the 3rd of December. Let me go across to Mukesh Aghi of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Mr. Aghi, always a pleasure to have you here on CNBC TV 18. Your recommendations, US ISPS recommendations to the two leaders on the issues that need to be thrashed out in the relationship.
I think it's important to understand that the trade between the two countries without a trade deal is growing. Either you look at it from a services side or on goods side. It seems to be moving in the positive direction. The first meeting which took place between Minister Goyal and Catherine Tai was a positive one. They agreed to talk more, and now she is coming to India. You have to understand that the early harvest would be a good win for both countries. We need to remove the impediments which can drive the trade between the two countries to a much, much higher level. You have to recall in 2015, then Vice President Biden said that he likes to see a trade going up to $500 billion between the two countries. And I think by removing a lot of these impediments, you will see the trade going up and up between two nations.
Right. Mr. Aghi, when you speak about impediments, localization, both on data storage and on domestic content, do you think this is likely to figure in that conversation? Have you made some recommendations to India on that front?
Yes, we have made a lot of recommendations to both to US government and also to government of India. And yes, there are issues on for example, on data localization. There are issues on medical devices. There are issues from H-1B visa issue for the Indian side. There are the issues on agriculture exports on both sides, shrimp exports from India to the US itself. I think as we remove those impediments, it is a win-win for both countries. It is important to understand if India is going to realize its economy to be a $5 trillion economy, it has to compete on a global basis. It has to increase its exports. And what we're seeing is that in the last quarter, India had record-breaking exports. And I think that's a good start, but we can improve on that quite a bit by having a good early harvest between the two countries.
Right. Mr. Aghi, you mentioned a range of issues that you have given recommendations on. Which would be on top of the priority list when it comes to US companies doing business in India, the biggest source of friction that you'd like to highlight?
I think from the U.S. perspective, definitely a clear direction on data localization. It is important to understand you have a policy from RBI, which is separate than policy from the central government side. I think we need more consistency there. It is also important that we have a clear direction, a win-win conversation on e-commerce side, because what happens is from India perspective, they need to protect the interest of the local traders, which is understandable. You want to maintain, preserve jobs. The question is, how do you get the e-commerce company to build that ecosystem to be able to provide world-class services to customers, but at the same time, do not replace jobs which are existent there. So I think there are multiple issues, but a constant dialogue will find the right solution, because we strongly believe that the maturity between two entities is very strong, and we will find the right solution.
Right. From the Indian side, give us a sense of the market access issues that Indian companies have been raising, things that could figure up in that conversation, and how is the US likely to warm up to those conversations?
You have to understand the biggest export of India to US is services, especially IT services, which is going up the value chain. And the challenges which these companies have is mobility, for example. It is important to address that issue because they are looking as to how we move not only just across the border people, but also be able to hire people also. So, and at the same time, you have to understand from a US perspective, we have a shortage of millions of software engineers. And the question really becomes is how do you fill that gap? You can't educate locally fast enough. You can put a lot of efforts there. So the question really becomes is, can we basically put some kind of a program to the graduates, Indian graduates in the US who can come into the work environment right away? So yes, there are political issues behind it, because there is a sentiment on anti-immigration, but it's important to understand the Indian student who comes into the workforce become a day one taxpayer and provides productivity and innovation to the local economy. So yes, there are issues from the Indian side, and definitely there are issues from the US side, but that's the nature of the beast. I think the question is how do we sort this out? And this meeting is important. There is a good camaraderie and chemistry between Minister Goyal and Catherine Tai. And so we hope to see some kind of an outcome which will show early results in these meetings.
Right. On behalf of Tesla, have you made any request to the Indian government? Tesla has made a request for a duty cut from 110% to about 40%. That move is still under consideration, we believe, and that too at the highest level. Any key recommendations you've made there?
I think it's not about duty cut here. It's about trying to bring innovation, especially on the EV side, to the local economy in India. It is not just about EV. What about the battery? You know, we are committed by 2070 zero net emission, and Tesla batteries, especially on household supply of electricity, has become very, very successful. So let's not just focus on EV side. I think Tesla value proposition on the battery is a good value proposition for the domestic market. So our recommendation is be open. Yes, you have to protect the local companies, you have to protect local innovation, but I think you need to create enough pressure point so they also become competitive on a global basis. And so our recommendation is have discussion with Tesla, make sure that they come in with innovative value proposition to the local economy.
Right. Mr. Aghi, thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18, giving us a sense of the issues that could crop up when Catherine Tai and the Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal meet later this month, and recommendations from the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum as well. Time now for a break here on Global Eye. Up next, it's the last day of COP26 Climate Summit. As the COP26 Summit wraps up in Glasgow, we take a look at the big question: how do we make the private sector more accountable for climate action? A special conversation with Juvencio Maestu of the Inca Group right after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching The Global Eye. As the COP26 summit is coming to a close, we take a look at the highlights. India committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2070. China, US announced plans to work together to cut down methane emissions. Over 100 global leaders pledged to end deforestation by 2030. China said it is targeting 1.8% cut in average coal use at power plants by 2025. China and Russia were criticized for missing the summit and for lack of urgency. I caught up with Huencio Maestu, the CFO and Deputy CEO of the Inca Group, about the role of the private sector in climate action. I began by asking him about how private sector can be made more accountable when it comes to reducing emissions. Listen in. Huencio, my first question, how can the private sector be made more accountable when it comes to positively working on reducing emissions and mitigating the climate crisis?
I think this is a good question. And it is important to say that businesses are becoming a point of reference for the many people. People start to trust business more than governments, NGOs, or other institutions. So businesses have a big role to play. How can business be more accountable? First is to be clear about the commitment to Paris Agreement, to stay within the 1.5 degrees. Secondly, is to really measure, based on science, the footprint that any business have in scope 1, in scope 2, but even more important in scope 3, because when you don't measure, you don't follow, and when you don't follow, you don't improve. And then based on that, is businesses to be transparent, is to be proud of the half-full glass and all the things that many companies are doing in a good way, but also to be transparent in the half-empty glass. And then by being transparent in the half-empty glass, to show progress and to take actions every day and to keep closing that gap. And I think it's important that we, all businesses, behave in a similar way, because by doing that, we can actually move mountains.
Also, tell us about IKEA's own 2030 goals and how are you implementing them across geographies, including India?
IKEA, we have decided to become climate positive by 2030. And this is by reducing more greenhouse gas emission than the IKEA value chain emit while growing the IKEA business, because this is important. It's actual reduction while growing the IKEA business. So you decouple growth from CO2 footprint. And we are highly committed and we will deliver. And the important thing is not only that we will do that before 2030, it's also that we have set goals. We set goals, for example, by 2020, that is just the past, about producing more renewable energy than we consume. And we achieved that because we are at 130% today. But also we have set goals that by 2025, all the EVs, all the last mile delivery will be on EV or zero emission.
How important is it for the world to have regulations on carbon pricing?
I think it's important. We do support global standard carbon pricing. We do support. And it has to be global and it has to be a standard, because you cannot have the different prices by different countries, and then you start to create differences. So we do support that as a mechanism. Then it has to come with 2 or 3 things for to be really working in the proper way. The first one, all the revenues that come from this taxation, we need transparency how these revenues are invested, because it's important that carbon taxation is leading to a transition in the economy. It's leading to the right investment, both in the social side, but also in the environment side, to really transform the economy. This is one. Secondly, I think it's important that this comes, the carbon taxation, also with clarity about stopping the subsidies for the fossil fuel economy in a time frame. So we really go into the transition mode. And thirdly, while the carbon taxes, it can be good, it might happen that some activities that are not good for the environment are still happening regardless of higher prices because of carbon taxation.
That's all we have time for on Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.